The summer of 1680 wrapped Madrid in a suffocating heat. The sun poured down relentlessly on the tiled roofs, and the narrow streets seemed to trap the warmth, turning the capital into a vast furnace of dust and sweat. Merchants in the bustling Plaza Mayor fanned themselves with scraps of parchment. Water carriers shouted through the crowds, hawking relief from the heat. The air hung heavy with the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts, horse manure, and incense drifting from church doors. Yet within the thick stone walls of the Alcazar, the royal palace that dominated Madrid's skyline, heat brought with it not only discomfort but shame. Inside those gilded chambers, perfumed air mingled uneasily with something far less pleasant. Courtiers shifted uncomfortably as a young princess walked past, whispering behind painted fans, masking their expressions with strained courtesy. "Her Royal Highness approaches," murmured one lady-in-waiting. Another quickly spritzed rosewater into the air, though the attempt was futile. Even the richest perfumes could not suppress what followed. At just 19, Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip Roman IV of Spain and niece to her own mother, Mariana of Austria, carried with her a stench so persistent that it clung to her presence like an invisible shroud. Contemporary whispers described it as damp mildew and rotting fish, a smell that returned no matter how many scented baths she took or how many exotic concoctions perfumers devised. The palace had grown used to disguising imperfections, powders to hide pallor, jewels to dazzle away deformities. But here was something they could not conceal. For the odor was not mere poor hygiene. It was a cruel symptom, one among many, of a practice that had plagued her family for generations. Marriage between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, all in the desperate attempt to preserve the power and property of the House of Habsburg. Visitors who arrived from foreign courts carried away the story in their reports. In France, where King Louis Roman XIV reigned at Versailles, ambassadors wrote of Spain's faltering dynasty, noting even the private humiliations of its heirs. Every defect became a weapon at the diplomatic table. In the long corridors of the Alcazar, Margarita Teresa tried to walk with dignity, back straight, chin lifted, every gesture drilled into her since childhood. But she felt the silence that followed her, the looks that lingered too long. She had been raised to believe herself the embodiment of Spain's glory, yet her very body betrayed the truth. Beyond the palace walls, Madrid citizens told stories of their princess with a mixture of pity and unease. Some claimed she was cursed, others whispered of divine punishment for the family's sins. In a city where the church bells told daily reminders of salvation and sin, such explanations felt natural. Ordinary people believed smells revealed the soul's condition, sickness, sin, or possession. The princess's odor, then, was more than a nuisance. It was a sign, a warning that heaven itself had turned against the Habsburgs. Inside the court, however, no such words could be spoken aloud. Instead, attendants drowned her chambers in lavender and rosemary. Perfumers burned costly resins imported from the Indies, and priests mumbled prayers to drive away whatever spirit haunted her flesh. But the scent always returned, stubborn, humiliating, unrelenting. From the shadows, older courtiers remembered her as a child, lively and bright, before her health began to decline. "Poor girl," some murmured. "She did not choose the blood she carries." Yet pity was dangerous in the Alcazar, where even compassion could be twisted into treason. So most kept their thoughts to themselves, lips sealed, nostrils discreetly covered. As the bells of the nearby San Gil convent told the hour, life in Madrid continued. Carriages rattled through dusty streets, students at the university debated theology, merchants bartered over bolts of silk from Genoa and silver from the New World. But within the palace, behind its heavy tapestries and guarded doors, the smell of decay lingered. It was more than a personal affliction. It had become a symbol, a reminder that the bloodline of Spain's great dynasty was unraveling, one symptom at a time. And at its center was a young woman who, despite her silks and jewels, could not escape the weight of her inheritance. From across the grand hall, Don Diego Velázquez de Silva observed in silence. His eyes, sharp even in old age, had traced the rise and decline of Spain's most powerful family for decades. As the king's court painter, he had been tasked with capturing not just their likeness, but their majesty, turning frailty into dignity, deformity into solemn grandeur. Yet canvas could not lie forever. Every brushstroke became an unintended chronicle of decline. Velázquez had painted Philip Roman IV in his youth, tall and stately, his features still bearing the strength of earlier Habsburg kings. But as the years passed, and as the marriages between uncle and niece piled one upon another, the faces he was asked to immortalize began to change. Jaws jutted forward into the infamous Habsburg chin, lips grew thick and pendulous, eyes sunken and weary beyond their years. Now, in Margarita Teresa, Velázquez saw a different kind of cruelty. The decline had not only twisted bone and muscle, but poisoned even the air around her. He remembered overhearing the royal physician, Luis Mercado, whisper to another doctor a phrase that stuck with him: the price of blood purity. Mercado had dared to publish a treatise years earlier, Morbis Hereditaris, warning of the dangers of such unions. He had written that children born of too close kin would be fragile, sickly, prone to early death, but the court had ignored him. The obsession with keeping Spain's empire in pure Habsburg hands outweighed any doctor's caution. Velázquez, who had studied the human form with an artist's intimacy, needed no medical training to see what the physician meant. His own portraits became a gallery of degeneration. In the proud stance of Philip Roman IV, there was strength. In his daughter's painted face, there was fragility, skin pale, lips trembling, eyes that seemed already tired of the world. And in Carlos, the young prince, Velázquez saw an even darker omen, a boy whose very body seemed sculpted by disease. Sometimes, when Velázquez was alone in his studio, he wondered whether posterity would see these portraits as tributes or as warnings. Perhaps future generations would not marvel at the jewels and velvets, but at the deformities behind them. Perhaps they would whisper, as the courtiers now whispered, about a dynasty unraveling from within. Outside Spain, these whispers were already being sharpened into weapons. French envoys described the Habsburg heirs with clinical cruelty. The Princess reeks. One diplomat recorded for the eyes of Louis Roman XIV. The prince stammers, cannot walk without pain, and is unlikely to breathe. Every weakness was a bargaining chip, every defect another thread France could tug loose from Spain's empire. But Velázquez's mind strayed not to politics, but to memory. He recalled painting the Infanta Margarita as a child, the same princess who now walked through corridors wrapped in lavender smoke. She had once been lively, playful, her laughter ringing in the halls as her small feet tapped against marble. He had painted her in his masterpiece Las Meninas, surrounded by ladies in waiting, a child glowing with innocence. Now, just a few years later, the girl had grown into a woman whose very presence evoked pity. The contrast haunted him. Art had always been a mirror of truth, yet in the Alcazar, truth itself had become unbearable. Powder and paint disguised deformities, jewels distracted the eye, but the portraits told their story nonetheless. Velázquez could only wonder if one day the world would look at these canvases and see what he saw. Not royal glory, but the slow undoing of a dynasty that had once ruled half the globe. As he set down his brush, the old painter sighed. His role was to immortalize their faces. But what he captured, stroke by stroke, was the legacy of a family whose pride had defied nature itself and was paying the price. In the bowels of the Alcazar, far from the glitter of the throne room, a woman named Maria stirred a steaming cauldron. She was one of the palace's older cooks, her hands worn from decades of grinding herbs and preparing broths for 3 generations of Habsburgs. Tonight, she worked not on supper, but on a remedy. Into the pot went crushed rosemary, thyme, vinegar, and a scattering of exotic spices brought from the Indies. Ingredients meant not to heal, but to mask. For the princess's scent had grown intolerable, and soon she was to meet the French ambassador. "Poor child," Maria muttered, her voice low. "She carries a burden no jewels can hide." The door burst open and the high steward rushed in, his velvet doublet damp with sweat. "Faster," he barked. "Her Highness will receive the ambassador within the hour. This must be ready." His voice trembled with urgency. France's envoy, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis of Torcy, was infamous for the sharpness of his eye and the cruelty of his reports. Already, dispatches to Versailles dripped with details of Spain's decline, the failing health of the royal children, the emptiness of Spain's treasury, the frailty of its armies. Another note about a princess who reeked of rot would only feed the Sun King's ambitions. A young page, emboldened by his youth, whispered, "No potion will cover that smell." His words earned him a sharp slap across the face. "Hold your tongue," snapped the steward. "You speak of the blood of Spain." But even in rebuke, his words betrayed a truth the court dared not say aloud. The blood of Spain was becoming its curse. Herbalists were summoned, perfumers hired at staggering expense. Remedies multiplied, vinegar baths, sachets of cloves sewn into dresses, oils rubbed into the skin. Physicians prescribed purgatives, claiming the odor rose from corrupted humors. Priests murmured exorcisms in her chambers, sprinkling holy water into every corner. Yet nothing held. The scent returned like a ghost, lingering in silks, woven into bedclothes, clinging to walls. Beyond the palace, the city buzzed with rumor. Madrid streets thrummed with speculation. Some claimed the princess was cursed, others that she carried within her the sins of her ancestors. At the taverns near the Puerta del Sol, men drank cheap wine and muttered that God himself was turning his face from the dynasty. For in Spain, smells were not merely physical, they were moral. A foul odor meant corruption of body and spirit. And if the royal family reeked, what did that mean for the kingdom? Ambassadors knew the answer: weakness. France's Colbert wrote of it in coded letters, describing Spain's heirs with brutal clarity. To Louis Roman XIV, each defect was leverage. Spain, once the master of Europe, now looked like prey. Inside the Alcazar, however, none of this mattered to Margarita Teresa herself. In her chambers, she sat in silence, enduring as ladies applied layer upon layer of scented powder, combed her pale hair, and fastened heavy jewels at her throat. The remedies brewed below would be dabbed on her wrists and behind her ears. She said nothing. Tears welled in her eyes, but she made no sound. To weep was weakness. To resist was rebellion. She had been raised to carry her bloodline's weight in silence. Outside her door, the steward paced nervously, clutching his perfumed handkerchief. The scent of rosemary and vinegar wafted faintly from the kitchens, mingling with the rising dread that filled the palace. For though the princess was about to meet an ambassador, the truth was unavoidable. The decline of a dynasty was no longer confined to whispers in the shadows. It could be smelled in the very air. In the dim light of her chambers, Margarita Teresa stood before a tall Venetian mirror framed in gilt. Around her, ladies-in-waiting moved with mechanical precision, powdering her face, tying ribbons, adjusting the fall of her gown. They spoke in soft murmurs, careful never to betray their thoughts aloud, though each caught whiffs of the odor that lingered despite all efforts. Rosewater had been poured over her skin, a thick paste of herbs dabbed behind her ears, but the scent of mildew and rot seeped through, stubborn as her own shadow. Margarita did not flinch. She had been taught since childhood to master her expression, to wear serenity like a second skin. But the mirror was merciless. What it reflected was not the image of the golden-haired child Velázquez had once painted in Las Meninas, glowing with innocence and vitality. Instead, a pale young woman stared back at herself with hollow eyes. The Habsburg jaw jutted cruelly, skin beneath her powder blotched with sickly hues. Her attendants draped dazzling jewels around her neck, heavy with emeralds and pearls brought from across the empire. But no brilliance could distract from the fragility beneath. She was adorned as a princess, yet she felt more like an effigy, an ornament to be displayed, a vessel for alliances, a symbol whose humanity mattered less than the blood she carried. "Your Highness," whispered one lady, fastening a ruby brooch at her breast, "the ambassador awaits." Margarita closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She remembered her lessons, repeated endlessly since girlhood: walk with dignity, speak with calm, show no weakness before strangers. Yet within her chest, fear gnawed. She knew why the ambassador had come, not just to pay respects, but to measure her, to carry tales of her health and beauty back to Versailles. Her very body had become a subject of international intrigue, dissected in letters and whispered over in council chambers. For young women of her rank, marriage was never personal. It was politics. Her worth was weighed not in kindness or intellect, but in her ability to bear heirs and symbolize strength. And in her heart, Margarita feared she embodied neither. She lifted her chin and drew a long, careful breath. The air burned her nostrils with the mingled scents of lavender, vinegar, and her own unyielding stench. Still, she forced composure. A Habsburg must never falter. When the chamberlain's voice rang at the door, "Your Highness, the ambassador is here," she gave a small nod. Her jewels rattled faintly as she turned from the mirror, hiding the tears that threatened to spill. "Let him in," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. And so, stepping into the hall of diplomacy, Margarita Teresa carried with her not just the perfume of herbs, but the silent burden of a dynasty whose decline now hung visible and palpable upon her very skin. In another wing of the palace, far from his sister's perfumed ordeal, the young heir to Spain's throne sat hunched over a heavy book. At 12 years old, Prince Carlos was already king in name, though the crown weighed heavier on his fragile body than gold ever could. His tutor, a weary scholar from Salamanca, pointed at the words with deliberate patience, trying once more to coax the boy into reading. "Your Majesty," he urged gently, Repeat after me." Carlos blinked slowly. His oversized tongue, too large for his mouth, made even simple syllables clumsy and garbled. His malformed jaw distorted the shape of words. The effort of speaking left him exhausted, and his dark, watery eyes drifted toward the tall window. Beyond the glass stretched the palace gardens, where noble children ran freely across the lawns, shouting, laughing, chasing one another with wooden swords. Their movements were effortless, unburdened by pain. Carlos watched them with longing. He had never joined their games, and he never would. His legs, bent and weakened by rickets, struggled to carry him more than a few steps without pain. Seizures struck unpredictably, leaving him trembling and frightened. Even the common cold, harmless to others, could become a mortal threat to him. The boy who was meant to embody the strength of an empire lived instead as a prisoner of his own frailty. The tutor's sigh echoed softly in the chamber. He was not the first to despair. Behind closed doors, physicians whispered that the prince lagged far behind other boys of his age, both in body and in mind. Some called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, believing that only sorcery could explain such a twisted fate. But those with keener eyes knew the truth lay not in curses, but in bloodlines. For centuries, the Habsburgs had turned inward, binding themselves in uncle-niece and cousin-cousin unions, as though power could be preserved by refusing the world. Each generation had been a gamble with fate, and with Carlos the dice had fallen hard. He was not merely weak, he was the culmination of centuries of genetic narrowing, a fragile vessel asked to carry the weight of a global empire. At times, the boy himself seemed to sense it. Watching the children in the garden, his lips moved as though to form words, but no sound came. His fingers clutched the edge of the book, knuckles pale as though he understood, without fully grasping, that he was not like them, that he could never be. His attendants hovered near, ever vigilant, for any sudden illness might be fatal. To the court, his body was not just his own, it was the body of Spain itself. Every faltering step, every missed word was a reminder that the empire's future rested on legs that bent under their own weight. And yet, in the silence of his chamber, Prince Carlos stared out at the sunlit gardens with a child's yearning, watching life rush past him like a game he would never be able to join. While his children struggled with ailments of body and spirit, King Philip Roman IV sat in the council chamber of the Alcazar, his once commanding presence dulled by age and exhaustion. The vast empire he had inherited was bleeding wealth into endless wars, its colonies restless, its people overtaxed. But even as the weight of France's ambitions and the decline of Spanish trade pressed on him, none of it haunted him as much as the fragile figure of his only surviving son. Around the long oak table, ministers murmured, parchments shuffled, and candles smoked against the heavy summer air. The Duke of Medina de las Torres leaned forward, voice steady but insistent. "Your Majesty must consider a marriage for Prince Carlos. He is young, yes, but succession cannot wait. The realm requires assurance." The king stroked his graying beard, eyes shadowed with thoughts he dared not voice. Physicians had spoken to him in private, their words couched in cautious Latin but clear in meaning. Carlos was unlikely ever to father a child. His malformed jaw, his weak body, his fits and fevers, all were signs of deeper afflictions. Some suspected hypogonadism, others more mysterious failings. But whatever the name, the conclusion was the same. The boy's seed was barren soil. Philip knew it. He had seen his son struggle to walk, to speak, to simply endure. And yet, what choice was there? A king without an heir was a kingdom without a future. Across Europe, other dynasties watched Spain's decline like vultures circling. Louis Roman XIV of France sharpened his diplomats into blades. The Austrian Habsburgs, though kin, prepared to stake their own claims. Even England and the Dutch Republic whispered of how Spain might be carved when the inevitable came. Still, the council pressed. Consider the royal houses of France, Austria, Portugal. The Duke urged, in fourth candidates. A union must be made. Philip raised his eyes at last, their hollowness betraying the guilt he carried. For had he not married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, after the death of his first wife? At the time, it had seemed wise, politically expedient, religiously sanctioned, a continuation of centuries of dynastic practice. But now, as he looked at the suffering of Margarita Teresa and the pitiful fragility of Carlos, the truth gnawed at him. This was not strategy. It was slow suicide. Yet he could not confess such thoughts before his council. To doubt the purity of Habsburg blood was to question the very legitimacy of Spain's crown. So he nodded gravely, masking despair with duty. "Bring me the names," he said at last. "From France, from Austria, from Portugal, the House of Habsburg must endure." The scribes dipped their quills and recorded the king's command, though all in the chamber felt the silence beneath his words. They were not preserving strength, they were gambling with ashes. And Philip Roman IV, weary sovereign of the richest and sickest dynasty in Europe, knew it. For all the gold pulled from the New World, all the armies raised and lost, the fate of his empire now hung on the frail body of a boy who could barely speak his own name. The clatter of hurried footsteps echoed through the Alcazar's marbled corridors. A messenger burst into the council chamber, bowing deeply before the king. In his trembling hands lay a folded letter, sealed with the wax of the steward. Philip Roman IV broke it open with a snap. As his eyes moved across the page, the color drained from his face. "There has been an incident," he murmured. His voice was thin, frayed with dread. The councilors leaned forward, their quills poised above parchment. "Your Majesty," the king's lips pressed into a line. The audience with the French ambassador was interrupted. Princess Margarita Teresa fainted. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Though no one dared say it aloud, all knew it was not the first time she had collapsed. The girl's health was as fragile as her brother's, her body as brittle as the family bloodline that had shaped it. Philip rose slowly, leaning on the arm of his chair, the weight of years and guilt dragging at his movements. "Adjourn the meeting," he said. "I must see my daughter." The long walk to her chamber stretched endlessly. As he moved, memories crowded his mind like ghosts. He remembered the day he had taken Mariana of Austria as his wife, his own niece, barely a woman at the time. Priests and ministers had praised the union as holy, ordained, a means to keep the Habsburg legacy intact. He had believed them. He had believed that blood could be purified by circling back on itself, binding family to family until the line became unbreakable. But what had that purity brought? A daughter whose body betrayed her with fainting spells and strange odors, a son twisted by weakness, a kingdom mocked abroad for heirs who could barely stand or speak. He had thought himself wise, politically shrewd. Yet as he climbed the steps toward Margarita's chamber, the truth pressed down on him. He had not preserved his house, he had poisoned it. When he entered, the sight pierced him deeper than any blade. Margarita lay on her bed, pale as wax, her lips trembling with shallow breaths. Attendants hovered with cloths soaked in vinegar, dabbing her temples, fanning her gently. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and for a moment she seemed not a princess but a frightened child. Philip sank into a chair at her side. He did not speak, for what words could he offer? He could not tell her that her suffering was the cost of his choices, the inheritance of centuries of marriages too close. He could only take her hand, frail and cool against his, and bow his head. In the silence, he heard the echo of the words Louis Mercado had once written. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring. How many times had those warnings been dismissed, buried beneath talk of dynastic pride, papal dispensations, and the illusion of strength? Now the evidence lay before him, as clear as the air he breathed. He had not only doomed his children, he might have doomed Spain itself. In the stillness of the royal library, a single candle guttered in the draught. Dusty tomes and scrolls crowded the shelves, silent witnesses to centuries of knowledge too often ignored. Here, the royal physician bent over a cracked manuscript, his eyes red with sleeplessness. He had been searching desperately for answers, something, anything, to halt the decline consuming Spain's royal bloodline. His trembling fingers paused over a line he knew too well. It was from Louis Mercado's old treatise, Morbis Hereditariis. The words, inked decades earlier, glared at him like a prophecy fulfilled. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces offspring fragile in body, prone to illness and disfigurement, and in the gravest cases, barren of issue. The physician closed his eyes. He had seen those words come alive in flesh. Margarita Teresa's fainting spells, Carlos's seizures and twisted frame, skin that bruised at the lightest touch, lungs that rattled after a mild chill. The dynasty's pride, its purity, was the poison coursing through its veins. Outside the library walls, thunder rumbled over Madrid. The storm clouds gathering above seemed an omen, the heavens themselves echoing the turmoil inside the Alcazar. Courtiers muttered that God was punishing Spain for its arrogance. Priests preached of demons, and commoners in taverns whispered of curses on the royal house. Yet the truth was simpler and more damning. Nature itself was revolting. The Habsburgs were not alone in such folly. The physician had studied histories of other dynasties who had tried to preserve their power by binding blood too tightly. In ancient Egypt, the Ptolemies had married brother to sister, producing rulers who were worshipped as gods but weakened as men. Among the pharaohs, the line had withered, collapsing under its own weight. Even in more recent centuries, whispers clung to certain noble houses of deformities and madness, whispers the Habsburgs had ignored, believing themselves immune. But no crown could escape the laws of nature. The physician dipped his quill and scribbled in the margin. They call it divine punishment, but it is the design of blood itself. The dynasty has built its tomb with its own marriages. He hesitated, knowing that such words, if discovered, could end his career or his life. Yet he wrote them anyway. Some truths, he thought, must survive, even if kings refused to hear them. Beyond the library, the Alcazar's halls reeked faintly of lavender wilted by damp stone, the scent now a grim emblem of decay. Every echo of thunder seemed to toll for Spain's ruling house. And though ministers still schemed and priests still prayed, the physician knew the truth that none dared speak aloud. The Habsburg line was unraveling, and no potion, prayer, or policy could stitch it whole again. The bells of Madrid tolled solemnly on a cool November morning in 1679. Their iron voices carried across the rooftops, mingling with the chants of priests and the murmurs of a restless crowd gathered outside the Cathedral of Santa Maria. Inside, beneath vaulted arches heavy with incense, the Spanish court assembled in all its splendor. Nobles glittered in silks and jewels, bishops glowed in gold-threaded vestments, but all eyes were fixed on the thin, sickly figure at the altar, Carlos Roman II, King of Spain. At just 18, Carlos looked more specter than sovereign. His attendants had powdered his pallid face and drenched him in perfume, yet his frailty could not be disguised. His infamous Habsburg jaw jutted so far forward that his lips could not quite close, forcing him to breathe through his mouth. His thin frame trembled beneath the weight of his brocade robes, and he leaned heavily on two attendants simply to remain upright. When the time came to speak his vows, the cathedral fell into uneasy silence. His oversized tongue, clumsy and thick, made his words a garbled whisper. The congregation held its breath, listening with a mix of pity and dread. Beside him stood Maria Louisa of Orleans, barely 17, the niece of Louis Roman XIV of France. She had arrived in Madrid only days earlier, a vibrant young woman thrust into a life she had not chosen. Court whispers claimed she wept bitterly upon seeing her groom for the first time, and who could blame her? For all the finery of the Spanish crown, the figure who bore it seemed scarcely fit to stand, much less to father heirs. Among the pews, courtiers leaned toward one another, their voices lowered to conspiratorial murmurs. Dona Elvira de Montoya, a noblewoman of 70 years, bent to her granddaughter's ear. "Look at his hands," she whispered. The girl obeyed discreetly. The king's fingers trembled violently as he struggled to slip the wedding ring onto his bride's hand. "Do you think he can have children?" the young woman asked, her voice barely audible. Elvira scowled, scandalized by the bluntness, but in truth, it was the question on every tongue. The entire future of Spain, an empire stretching across oceans, now rested on this marriage, on this frail boy's ability to sire an heir. And the odds, everyone knew, were cruelly slim. At the very front, Queen Mother Mariana of Austria kept her face composed, her gaze fixed on her son. She had been the true power behind the throne during Carlos's long minority, and she meant to keep it so. Like her son, she was both product and defender of the Habsburg tradition, daughter of the Austrian emperor, sister to Philip Roman IV, wife to her own uncle. For her, dynastic marriage was not sin but sacred duty. Yet even she, watching her son sway unsteadily at the altar, could not silence the shadow of doubt creeping through the cathedral's incense-laden air. Farther back, the Austrian ambassador scribbled mental notes for his report to Vienna. His dispatch would be unflinching. The King of Spain can scarcely stand without support. His weakness is such that it is doubtful he will ever consummate his marriage, much less beget an heir. The vows were completed at last, though in halting syllables, and Cardinal Portocarrero raised trembling hands to bless the union. The choir's voices soared, but they could not dispel the unease that settled like a pall over the congregation. This was no ordinary royal wedding. It was a gamble, a last desperate hope that the bloodline might endure. As the newlyweds turned to face the crowd, Carlos's arm shook as he offered it to his bride. Maria Louisa forced a polite smile, her face pale but composed, the mask of a young woman who understood too well that she was not marrying a man, but a kingdom's dying legacy. And in the silence that followed the final blessing, more than one courtier wondered if they had just witnessed not the birth of a new chapter for Spain, but the beginning of its end. After the solemn vows, the royal procession wound its way back through the streets of Madrid toward the Alcazar. Crowds gathered to glimpse their young king and his new French bride, but the cheers were muted, uncertain. For all the banners and fanfare, there was no disguising what had been seen inside the cathedral. A monarch so frail he had to be held upright by others, his vows barely audible, his hands shaking as though from fever. Inside the palace's great hall, however, appearances had to be maintained. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted game, pheasants stuffed with almonds, wheels of manchego cheese, marzipan, and oranges brought from Valencia. Silver platters gleamed with candied fruits and exotic spices from the New World. Goblets were filled to the brim with deep red wine, and musicians struck up lively airs on lutes and viols. On the surface, it was a celebration befitting Spain's empire. But beneath the glitter, unease clung like a shadow. At the high table, Carlos Roman II sat slumped beside Maria Luisa. His jaw ached with every bite, the simple act of chewing made nearly impossible by the overgrowth of bone. Servants discreetly replaced his roasted meats with soft broths and purees, which he sipped in small, pained mouthfuls. His new bride forced a smile, whispering gentle words, but her eyes darted nervously at the sight of her husband's trembling hands. From their seats across the hall, foreign envoys watched with hawk-like attention. The Duke of Medina de las Torres, the king's closest advisor, leaned toward the Constable of Castile. "Look at how they stare," he muttered darkly, "like vultures circling a dying beast." The constable's lips pressed into a grim line. "They already weigh the division of our lands," he replied. And indeed, across the hall, the French ambassador raised a goblet in a toast, his expression unreadable, while the Austrian envoy took careful notes. England and the Dutch Republic had sent observers as well, each calculating what Spain's inevitable collapse might mean for their own ambitions. Maria Luisa, though only 17, grasped the weight of what surrounded her. She was no longer simply a girl from the French court. She was a living treaty, a fragile bridge between two empires locked in rivalry. Every smile she gave, every glance she stole toward her husband, was a performance under scrutiny. Musicians played, courtiers danced, and wine flowed, but the mood was strained. Behind every toast to the union of Spain and France lay the unspoken truth. All of Europe doubted it would produce an heir. At one end of the hall, a poet long past his prime, Francisco de Quevedo, leaned toward a younger companion, his eyes sharp despite his years. "Look closely at the king," he whispered. "Do you see it?" The youth studied Carlos, his pale lips pressed against the rim of his goblet, his fingers trembling even as he lifted the cup. "I see sadness," the boy replied softly, "an emptiness." "It is the weight of a dying bloodline," Quevedo said, his voice low and bitter. "A crown cannot shield him from that." The younger man frowned. "Do you think he knows it himself?" "Enough to feel the burden," Quevedo answered, "but not enough to see the irony. The very policy that made his house great is the same that will destroy it." Laughter rang out across the hall as dancers twirled, but the words clung like smoke. For in that feast of shadows, everyone, from nobleman to poet, from ambassador to bride, sensed that Spain's golden age had ended, and the empire's future now trembled in the hands of a boy barely strong enough to raise his own cup. As dusk settled over Madrid, the Alcazar glowed with candlelight. The wedding feast had ended, musicians silenced, and the clatter of goblets replaced by a deeper, more anxious silence. For while the day's ceremony had bound Carlos Roman II and Maria Luisa of Orleans in holy matrimony, the true test of the marriage still lay ahead. Tonight, Spain's future would be measured not in treaties or vows, but in the bedchamber. In the Queen's apartments, Maria Luisa sat rigid as her ladies-in-waiting prepared her. They combed her hair, perfumed her skin with rose oil, and removed the heavy silks of her wedding gown. Each gesture was deliberate, rehearsed, almost ceremonial. One whispered words of comfort, another slipped in cautious advice, their voices low as though speaking too loudly might summon misfortune. The Duchess of Terranova leaned close, her voice steady but firm. "Remember, Majesty, Spain's future rests on tonight." The young queen nodded faintly, though her stomach twisted with dread. Raised in the brilliant court of Versailles, she had been taught that royal marriages were duties, not romances. Still, nothing in her girlhood had prepared her for the frail, trembling figure she had seen at the altar. The thought of what awaited her in the nuptial chamber chilled her blood. Elsewhere in the palace, Carlos Roman II endured his own preparations. Gentlemen of the bedchamber undressed him, careful with his trembling limbs. They bathed him in perfumed water, combed his thin hair, and slipped him into linen nightclothes embroidered with gold thread. Before sending him off, they handed him a potion, an infusion of herbs, exotic spices, and ground animal parts, rumored to strengthen virility. The king sipped obediently, his eyes dull with exhaustion. All of Madrid, it seemed, held its breath. The consummation of a royal marriage was not merely private, it was an affair of state. Tradition dictated that the couple be escorted to their bedchamber under watchful eyes, the ritual choreographed step by step. Behind closed doors, their intimacy was still haunted by expectation, for the court awaited signs that the union had been sealed. Even the sheets themselves might be inspected, a practice as old as monarchy. And so, as midnight approached, the young couple was led to their chamber. Courtiers whispered prayers, priests crossed themselves, and nobles exchanged furtive glances. Some murmured rumors already spreading through the court, that Carlos's body was malformed beyond function, that he was incapable of consummation, that Spain's future was doomed before the night had even begun. Others insisted that with God's grace, a miracle might occur, that a fragile body could yet carry out its most sacred duty. Within the chamber, candles flickered over gilded furniture and tapestries woven with biblical scenes. Maria Luisa, her heart racing, lay still as her husband was guided toward her. His breathing was ragged, his frame trembling with fatigue. For Carlos, this moment was not simply terrifying, it was crushing. All his life he had been told he was the vessel of Spain's hope. Tonight, that hope pressed down like a stone. In a nearby chapel, monks prayed aloud, their voices rising in fervent chant. "Grant strength to our king, O Lord, and the courage to fulfill his sacred duty." But even among them, some whispered to one another, was this really God's will? Or was the frailty of this king a message in itself, a divine judgment on centuries of arrogance? Beyond the chamber doors, the courtiers waited in tense silence. A single night held the weight of an empire, and as the candles burned low, the whispers grew darker. For though Spain's nobility spoke of faith, of duty, of miracles, in their hearts they feared the truth. No ritual, no prayer, no potion could undo the curse that was written in the Habsburg blood. Days turned to weeks, and whispers swelled into certainties. The marriage of Carlos Roman II and Maria Luisa had not been consummated. Courtiers spoke in hushed voices, careful not to be overheard, but the news seeped through the corridors like smoke. Some blamed the king's weakness, others his fear. Still others suggested a darker truth, that his body was simply incapable of the act upon which an empire depended. Physicians were summoned, each more confident than the last. They brought potions brewed from roots and minerals, powders from the Indies, tinctures of ginseng, even crushed pearls dissolved in wine. When remedies failed, they turned to stranger cures. Blood baths, first from bulls, then chickens, then even goats, were prescribed to invigorate the king's loins. Still nothing. Priests, unwilling to concede defeat to medicine, declared that the king was bewitched. Exorcisms were performed in secret chambers, holy water sprinkled across his bed, relics of saints placed beneath his pillows. Some claimed they had seen his body convulse as the demons were cast out. Others whispered that it was only another seizure, one of many that had plagued him since childhood. But failure did not stop the attempts. It only deepened the desperation. Alchemists were called from Italy, men who promised elixirs of eternal potency. One brought a vial of liquid mercury, declaring it the essence of virility. Another swore by a talisman forged from iron nails pulled from a crucifix. Courtiers smuggled amulets into his chambers, while midwives muttered prayers to obscure saints. Every superstition, every scrap of forgotten lore was grasped at like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Meanwhile, Maria Luisa bore her own torment. Each morning she endured the eyes of the court, searching her face for signs of triumph or despair. Rumors painted her cruelly, as frigid, as uncooperative, as unlucky. None dared say the obvious, that no queen, however willing, could change the truth of her husband's frail body. Alone in her chamber she wept, but only her ladies-in-waiting saw the tears. Outside the palace walls, the people of Madrid made sense of it in their own way. Some said witches had cursed the king at birth. Others believed God himself had closed his body, punishing Spain for its arrogance and sins. In taverns, men drank toasts to miracles that never came. "If our king cannot give us an heir," one soldier muttered bitterly, "then France will." But amidst the swirl of superstition, there were a few who saw more clearly. A younger physician, trained in Italy, whispered his heretical thought to his journal. "The ailment is neither curse nor demon. It is the blood itself, too tightly bound." He knew he could not speak such words aloud. To accuse the Habsburgs of crafting their own downfall was to court ruin. Yet his notes, hidden away, were a glimpse of the future. Centuries later, science would vindicate him. Carlos likely suffered from compounded recessive disorders, perhaps Klinefelter syndrome, perhaps pituitary insufficiency, conditions that explained his frailty, his seizures, and his infertility. For now, however, the court chose faith over fact, ritual over reason. And each failed cure, each wasted prayer, drew Spain closer to the precipice. 10 years passed, and still the royal marriage remained barren. Maria Luisa of Orleans, once a spirited bride with a will to endure, withered under the strain of court life and unfulfilled expectations. In 1689, she died suddenly at just 26 years old. Officially, her death was attributed to a ruptured appendix, but in whispered conversations behind closed doors, many said she had simply lost the will to live. Years of sorrow, humiliation, and isolation had drained her until nothing remained. Carlos was devastated. He retreated deeper into melancholy, his body weakening further with each passing season. Yet royal duty did not permit him long in mourning. Within months, Ambassadors were already negotiating a new match. This time, the chosen bride was Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess renowned for her fertility. Her mother had birthed 23 children. To the desperate eyes of Spain's court, she seemed a living promise, a vessel strong enough to save the dynasty. The wedding was celebrated with pomp, but beneath the surface, fear gnawed. Courtiers watched Mariana's every movement, waiting for signs of pregnancy that never came. Tensions rose, and blame was cast in all directions. Some accused Mariana of deceit, whispering that she feigned attempts at motherhood while secretly aligning herself with foreign interests. Others claimed she was cursed, another cruel trick of fate. Few dared speak the truth, that the fault lay not with the queen but with the king. In the gardens of El Buen Retiro, far from the prying eyes of ministers, the royal botanist José Cur y Martínez observed nature's patterns with quiet dread. He had long studied the effects of inbreeding among plants. When seeds from the same stock were cross-pollinated too often, their offspring grew stunted, more vulnerable to disease. The plants lost their vigor, their strength diminished with each generation. Kerr murmured to himself as he tended the beds of rosemary and thyme. It is as if nature resists what man insists upon. He dared not voice the parallel aloud, but it haunted him. The Habsburg line was no different from his fading plants. Meanwhile, in the salons of Europe, Spain's tragedy was already the subject of grim calculation. Louis Roman XIV of France smiled behind closed doors, sharpening alliances for the day when Spain's throne would fall vacant. In Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs made their own preparations, believing the Spanish crown would rightfully return to them. To diplomats, Carlos's infertility was not only a personal tragedy, it was the opening move of a continental struggle. And through it all, Carlos himself seemed dimly aware of his fate. On rare lucid days, he confessed to his confessor a dream of a son, strong and healthy, who might carry on his name. But perhaps God does not wish it, he whispered. His confessor, bound by duty, offered prayers and comfort, though in his heart he wondered whether it was not God but man, arrogant, blind, unyielding, who had sealed the king's barren destiny. The court still clung to rituals, to remedies, to prayers, but hope had begun to wither. The empire's might, once measured in fleets and armies, now hung on the fragile body of a king who could not give it an heir. And as the years crept forward, the truth grew undeniable. Spain was running out of time. By the late 1690, the Spanish court had transformed into a house of shadows. Once the Alcazar had rung with the laughter of feasts and the pomp of victory processions. Now its halls echoed with prayers, hushed debates, and rumors that spread like wildfire. Every eye was fixed on Carlos Roman II, not as a monarch in command, but as a patient on borrowed time. Doctors came and went like passing seasons. Some bled him to balance his humors. Others prescribed strange diets of chocolate and wine, while still others insisted on potions brewed from powdered gemstones or animal marrow. Nothing worked. Priests performed exorcisms at his bedside, chanting until their voices cracked. Relics of saints were pressed against his skin. Rosaries dangled above him as he convulsed in seizures. When his weakness deepened, courtiers whispered of curses, that witches had doomed him, that enemies of Spain had ensorcelled the king from birth. But the truth was simpler and crueler. His body was unraveling because it had never been whole. Carlos himself seemed dimly aware of this grim irony. Some evenings, when his fits subsided, he would sit alone in the gardens of El Escorial, watching birds cut across the sky. Sometimes, he confessed to his confessor, "I dream of a son, a boy with strong arms and clear eyes, a boy who could carry my name." His voice would falter, but perhaps God does not wish it. To those who heard, the words were heartbreaking. Yet others wondered if this was not God's will at all, but the stubborn will of men who had defied nature for centuries. The repeated marriages of uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, had turned Spain's greatest strength, its dynastic pride, into a noose tightening around its neck. At court, desperation hardened into superstition. Nobles spoke of omens, the collapse of a church roof during Mass, comets streaking across Madrid's skies, miscarriages among noble families. Signs, they whispered, that Spain is cursed. Ministers turned inward, plotting and maneuvering not for the future of Carlos's line, but for the inevitable succession struggle to come. France and Austria sharpened their claims, while England and the Dutch Republic prepared to weigh in. Europe, like a predator, waited for the king's last breath. And yet, amid the political storm, Carlos remained oddly passive and childlike in his confusion, almost spectral in his resignation. He was the symbol of a dynasty's ruin, a man trapped in the paradox of his birth, crowned as ruler of the world's greatest empire, but powerless to rule even his own body. The court still clung to rituals, still whispered prayers, still searched for remedies. But among the shadows, a darker certainty took hold. Spain's golden age had already died. What remained was a bloodline staggering toward its end, led by a king who could only dream of the strength he never possessed. On a cold November morning in the year 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once again. This time, they rang not for marriage or feast, but for death. Carlos Roman II, last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was gone at just 39 years of age. His body, ravaged by decades of seizures, fevers, and decay, lay in the royal chapel, draped in black velvet. Courtiers gathered in hushed silence, their faces pale with the knowledge that they were witnessing the end of an age. A rare autopsy was ordered, and what the physicians found stunned even the most hardened among them. His body contained almost no blood. His heart was shriveled, scarcely larger than a peppercorn. His lungs were mottled and rotting, his intestines riddled with gangrene. Only one testicle was found, blackened and shriveled, while his skull revealed a brain swollen with fluid. To the medicine of the time, it was a ghastly mystery. To modern science, it is unmistakable. The end stage of dynastic self-destruction, the toll of centuries of intermarriage that had concentrated every weakness into a single body. In the Alcazar, ministers and nobles gathered to hear the reading of his will. Tension crackled through the hall as the notary broke the seal. All of Europe held its breath, for Spain's throne was not merely a crown. It was an empire stretching from the Americas to the Philippines. When the name was read aloud, the chamber erupted. Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis Roman XIV of France, a Bourbon. The French ambassador allowed himself a triumphant smile. The Austrian envoy's face darkened in fury. In that moment, the War of the Spanish Succession began, not with a battle, but with a signature. Spain's empire, once held together by the brittle thread of Habsburg blood, now became the prize for Europe's hungriest powers. Yet beneath the political storm lay a deeper, unspoken truth. The dynasty that had once ruled the world's largest empire had not been destroyed by foreign armies or peasant revolt. It had destroyed itself. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity, Their fear of contaminating their line with foreign blood had sealed their fate. In seeking to preserve themselves, they had written their own extinction. Centuries later, Carlos Roman II remains a haunting figure. His portraits hang in museums, his jutting jaw, vacant stare, and withered frame a testament not to power, but to consequence. He is remembered not as a ruler of might, but as a warning of what happens when pride defies nature, when politics overrides biology, and when a crown is passed too often from uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. In the silent shadows of El Escorial, where he lies buried among kings, the stone epitaph marks him simply. But history remembers him by another name whispered in his time: El Hechizado, the bewitched, not cursed by demons, but by the arrogance of his own bloodline. And with his death, the great Spanish Habsburg dynasty collapsed, not with a war cry or rebellion, but with a sigh, the quiet ticking of a genetic time bomb set generations before.